What's up, you guys? Void here coming back at y'all with another patron-requested deck tech for Commander. This time we're going to be doing another one for Frogger Pirate. Last time he gave me the option of Cathar or Grand Arbiter Augustin, and I chose the less oppressive one, which was Cathar at the time. But now he's forcing me to do Grand Arbiter Augustin, and honestly, he just doesn't play that well with others, which is a big reason why I have hesitated to do anything involving Grand Arbiter Augustin. I just don't really think he's that enjoyable to play with or against, but we can make the deck a little bit more political. Not so much just about the oppression, but the deck is still incredibly oppressive. That's what the whole theme is. If you're not going to build around taxing your opponents for spells or attacking with creatures, then you're not playing Grand Arbiter right. So if you don't know who Grand Arbiter Augustin is, he's a 4 mana in Azorius colors for a 2/3 legendary creature human advisor. Makes all of your white spells cost 1 less to cast, all of your blue spells another 1 less to cast, and spells your opponents cast, which is the most important part, they cost 1 more. So the differential here is basically 2 mana. All of their stuff is going to cost 1 more. All of your stuff, for the most part, is going to cost at least 1 less. This doesn't include colorless spells, your artifacts, stuff like that. So all that is just advantage. It's pure Azorius bad stuff, which isn't good for your opponents. Fantastic for you. You can just fill your deck with similar cards that do something like that, and it works out pretty well. So we're going to go on to the lands here. We have a ton of mana fixing in Azorius colors, but if I had to say anything that was noteworthy, especially for control builds, you want to have your Reliquary Tower. You could draw potentially a lot of cards. Don't want to have to discard any of them. Strip Mine is never a bad thing. You're going to make their spells cost 1 more. You might as well take away some of the better lands at the table. That's about it for noteworthy lands. Our artifacts are going to be a combination of all things good consistency, mana ramp, and tax effects. We obviously have Sensei's Divining Top, Soul Ring, good staples in any deck really, but in control, Sensei's is definitely awesome. Azorius Signet and Talisman of Progress, gonna get us the colored mana that we need, which is always a nice thing having these out on turn 2. Lightning Greaves, Grand Arbiter is likely going to be the main target at the table, making everyone's spells cost 1 more. There are very few decks that don't really care about that, so you might as well give him some sort of protection or shroud. Sphere of Resistance, now we get to the good stuff here. Spells in general, so your spells as well, cost 1 more to cast, which isn't going to affect you too much. It's just going to make your spells, for the most part, just break even. The important part is that your opponents are going to have to be paying yet another mana more to cast the spells that they want to cast, which is just ridiculous. Get this out earlier in the game. Get out your Grand Arbiter, obviously, before you want to put this out, so that your opponents are going to be struggling. If you control their mana base, if you control how they spend their mana, you're likely going to win the game as the control player. Thorn of Amethyst isn't as good, but it just makes it to where non-creature spells cost 1 more to play, so a little bit more specific, but again, it's good for control matchups. Making their counter spells cost more can put them in very uncomfortable positions. Thought Vessel, another 2 mana rock, taps for colorless, but gives us no maximum hand size. Torpor Orb, another 2 mana artifact that is just all oppression. Creatures entering the battlefield don't cause abilities to trigger. That's basically what this deck is going to be. You might be able to hate on the niche deck at the table that focuses entirely on ETBs, which there aren't too many niche decks around ETBs. A lot of decks benefit off of ETBs, but there are a lot of cards in here that are going to kind of hate on one thing in particular in the hopes that you eventually get to one thing at the table and you just punish that really well. Winter Orb is just pretty good. We have a good cost reduction for us, so we shouldn't care too much about the mana that we're not going to be untapping the lands for. But for the most part, this is going to yet again punish our opponents more than it's going to punish us. Crawl Space, again, we're going to be public enemy number 1. You might as well make it harder for them to swing at you. Crawl Space is going to make it to where token decks or decks that want to go wide and swing at you are going to have a tougher time at making contact. Gilded Lotus, taps for colored mana, which is the most important part, but yet again another good mana rock. Norn's Annex is a pretty good tax effect. You're going to see a lot of those in here as well, not just for casting spells, but for attacking. Whenever they attack with a creature, they have to pay Phyrexian white mana, which means either 1 white mana or 2 life, which comes in handy against, yet again, those decks that want to go wide. Then we have a newer inclusion in the deck, the Immortal Sun, which actually works out pretty well, because it does give us cost reduction of 1 to all of our spells, so it kind of goes pretty well with Grand Arbiter, and also lore-wise, it's kind of flavorful as well. But again, Again, it hates on those Planeswalker decks. It's kind of niche, but if you can hate on one thing in particular with multiple different cards, I think you're going to cast a wide enough net to where you can hate on enough people. I think that's pretty cool. You get basically a Howling Mind just for you, and your creatures also get +1/+1, which isn't as relevant. We don't play a whole bunch of creatures. We don't really care too much about attacking. There are other win cons in the deck. Now moving on to creatures, we have Grand Abolisher, 2-drop little dude that just makes it very difficult for the control decks at the table, other than you, of course. They have to do stuff on their turn. They can't really do it on your turn, or they have to, at the very least, do it on someone else's turn. You basically get to do what you want uncontested as long as he's on the field, so that is pretty cool. Snapcaster Mage, we have a lot of good instants and sorceries. You want to flash those back. Pretty good in control. Thalia, basically Thorn of Amethyst, but on a creature. Again, 2 mana, get this out earlier on, with Grand Arbiter, going to make it very painful for your opponents. Fate Spinner is a really cool card. Basically, it forces your opponents to choose between their draw step, their main phase, or their combat phase. And whichever one they choose, they have to skip that one. They have to skip all instances of phases or steps during that turn. So that is really cool if your opponents want to go combat. You know, they're probably going to have to skip either their draw phase or their main phase, so it means that they're either not going to draw a card to attack you, or they're not going to play any other spells. So, really cool, very underrated, good for this type of political deck, where you're going to make your opponents think about what they do. Controlling how they act is a big part of politics. Tahlia, Heretic, Cathar, the other Tahlia. This one is basically just what you want to slow down your opponents earlier on in the game. Still pretty good. We have a lot of other cards that do this a little bit better, but she is definitely good value on a creature. You know, 3/2 first strike. Creatures and non-basic lands. Yeah, that's a pretty big deal. Vryn Wingmare is yet again another Thorn of Amethyst effect. Now creature spells cost 1 more. It is 3 mana for a 2/1 flyer, so it's a little bit more expensive, and not likely to be something that's going to stay on the board as long. But still, I mean, making your opponents pay more for their spells is always a good thing, no matter how you can get it. Windborn Muse is basically a ghostly prison on a creature. Creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 mana for each creature that is attacking you. So again, all those tax effects in the deck, it's just going to add up. It's going to make it very difficult for them to deal with you, period, whether it's casting spells or attacking you, which is the whole point of the deck. Then we move on to one of the more powerful cards in the deck, Spelltithe Enforcer, 5 mana for a 3/3 elephant wizard. Whenever an opponent plays a spell, they have to sacrifice a permanent unless he or she pays 1 generic additional, which is just insane, because there are definitely going to be times where their backs are up against the wall and they're going to have to cast spells, and in addition to this, they're going to be paying more mana, and they have to really choose, is it worth casting the spell if I have to sacrifice a permanent, which a lot of the time it isn't, because you're always going to have priority be an issue and people don't want to cast spells if someone else can do it for them. Another thing that is very political about the deck, not everyone's going to want to contribute and stop the Grand Arbiter if it means that they're going to be held behind in the game. And then we have Consecrated Sphinx, going to give you that consistency in card draw, which can get out of hand pretty quickly. If anyone else has a card draw engine, you can just take advantage of that. It can be quite impressive. Sun Titan, how we get back a lot of our permanents, CMC3 or less, from our graveyard, which is very important. We have a lot of those tax effects, ghostly prison type cards that sometimes we want to get those back, protect ourselves. Sun Titan is always good in white. We have 13 enchantments, and they're all pretty good. We have Authority of the Consuls, which is one of those effects again where we want to slow down our opponent's creatures. They enter the battlefield tapped under their control, and whenever a creature enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, you gain 1 life. So first of all, you're the control deck. You're probably not going to be able to match up with their creatures. Slow them down if you can. That's pretty good. And also you gain a bunch of life, because there are a lot of token decks in the format, a lot of decks where you have elves, goblins, decks that want to get out there pretty quickly with a whole bunch of creatures, and you can gain that much life. It puts a huge cushion between you and your opponents. They can't really do that much, and they eventually have to climb a much bigger hill, and that's something that not a lot of decks can do very well. We have a land tax because, hey, we don't always have the best ramp in these colors, so we might as well just get some lands, ensure that we can get our land drops. One of the best cards that you can play turn 1, especially if you're not the player going first, because it can pretty much just ensure that, hey, either your opponents are going to intentionally miss their land drops, or you're going to guarantee yourself a land drop for the rest of the game, pretty much. So it's a fantastic card, gives you a ton of card advantage as well. Mystic Remora, again, taxing our opponents isn't always going to be mandatory, but sometimes they want to prevent you from drawing cards, but this forces them to pay 4 more mana than they actually want to, which means they're probably never going to. That's in addition to all the other taxes on non-creature spells. So fantastic card. has a cumulative upkeep that you do have to pay, but 1 mana at a time really shouldn't be that big of a deal. Blind Obedience, yet again, very much like Authority of the Consoles, has Extort, which is pretty cool because you can just gain some life off of that, very underrated, but going to affect your opponent's artifacts and creatures. They're going to enter the battlefield tapped. So it doesn't do anything else, but it does enough to where it's going to punish a lot of the creature decks at the table. Rest in Peace, again, kind of one of those cards that's going to affect the graveyard-based decks. Again, not every single deck is going to be graveyard-based, but it's a very good deck to the point where letting it get out of hand could definitely hinder our ability to win the game. Aura of Silence, again, not every single deck's going to be heavy into artifacts and enchantments, but making them cost more is just insane. Your opponent's Soul Rings are going to cost 3 mana, might as well turn them into Worn Power Stones. This goes for all the heavy enchantment-based decks as well. Auras, stuff like that, they're all going to cost 2 more. Fantastic card. It can also sacrifice itself when the going gets tough. You can sacrifice it to destroy an artifact or enchantment, which is awesome removal. Ghostly Prison and Propaganda, both cards I'm going to reference a lot when it comes to taxing your opponents. They both do basically the same exact thing. They have to pay 2 mana for each creature that's attacking you, which is fantastic. Imprisoned in the Moon is very good, very underrated removal for creatures, lands, and planeswalkers. It just turns them into a colorless land, and they lose all other card types and abilities, so they pretty much are helpless to stop that, especially if you throw this onto one of their commanders. The Tuck rule, when they adjusted it for Chaos Warp, cards like that, where you could just shuffle their commander back into their deck. Nope, this gets around it. It turns them into a land. It doesn't exile, doesn't bounce it, doesn't get rid of it in any other way. Just turns it into a land, which is very cool. Very underrated removal. Cards like these are awesome in the commander format. We have Eristic Society because, again, we have a lot of cards that already tax our opponents, making them pay 1 more mana in addition to paying 1 more mana multiple different times. Eventually, we're just going to draw cards by default because our opponents are going to be so busy paying the other taxes that Eristic Studies just kind of go under the radar there. Pretty cool card. Solemnity, again, going to go after a very specific deck type in the format, which is usually going to be +1/+1 counters. Players can't get counters, so it's going to go up against the Infect decks pretty well. It's going to go up against the decks like Mariner Clan Neltoth. You don't get experience counters, so that's pretty nasty. And those counters can't be put on artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or lands. So if you have any good creatures, which is mainly what this is going to hurt, I don't exactly know, but I think this might unintentionally go off with Dark Depths. You might have to face a Merit Lodge, but still a pretty good card, going to go after another specific deck type. Then we have Kismet, yet again another slow down your opponent type effect. Their artifacts, their creatures, and their lands all enter the battlefield tapped. So it's even better than all the other ones because it affects lands, period, not just non-basic lands. And it also goes after good artifacts, mana rocks, and creatures. So one of the better slowdown effects. Sphere of Safety, going to top them all off. Going to make the tax even higher dependent on how many different enchantments we control. So if we have the other ones in play, the tax is going to get pretty high. We do have 13 enchantments, but we should have enough on the board to where even another 2 more mana is still pretty good, in addition to having something else like a Ghostly Prison or Propaganda at the same time. Never really a bad thing. Then we move on to our sorceries. We have 14 of them. We start off with Ponder and Preordain. When it comes to 1 mana cantrips in the format, these 2 are usually the best. You also have Brainstorm, but if we have better shuffle effects, that's going to be a more useful card to us. Council's Judgment, going to make the deck a little bit more political. Will of the Council, starting with you, each player votes for a non-land permanent you don't control, which is the important part. Your opponents can't just team up against you and say, hey, let's just get rid of Grand Arbiter. It has to be a permanent that you don't control, so the non-land permanent is probably going to eventually be something you don't like. Now, unfortunately, they do have the option of teaming up against you and choosing a non-land permanent that doesn't really matter in hopes that they eventually get to overpower you. So that is the one way that this card can go wrong, but still pretty good because for the most part, people want to get rid of threats anyway, and they're not just going to waste removal if they have the option of getting rid of another good card on the field, even if it isn't yours. We have Armageddon because we also play another card in here that's going to work out pretty well with Armageddon. But even if we don't get that card, we have the ability to say, hey, I have Grand Arbiter and maybe I have other tax effects. Even if you do get 1 or 2 land drops here, you're probably never going to get back into this game because I have, again, Grand Arbiter and other tax effects. So very brutal, probably more brutal than a lot of other decks, but Armageddon is just a disgusting card. Day of Judgment, Wrath of God, Supreme Verdict, 4 mana Wrath effects. They're going to put in a lot of work. when you're down, which is very likely in this deck. I mean, people are going to gang up on you. You want to be able to board wipe pretty easily, and those tend to be the best. Rite of Replication. Not necessarily a win con, but up against certain decks, you can pick their best creatures that they have on the board. Rite of Replication. And that's one way you could try to get back into this game, but using a Rite of Replication on something like Vryn Wingmare, maybe something like that, making your opponent's spells cost even more. Yeah, it's going to punish you too, but I think that's a pretty funny interaction that your opponents are going to have to pay 5 more mana for their non-creature spells. And you also get some little flying creatures as well. I think that's a pretty cool interaction. We have Bribery, because again, we don't always depend on our creatures to win games. We want to steal something from our opponent's decks, and this is usually one of those game-changing type of cards too, so it's pretty cool. We have Fractured Identity. I think this is also pretty cool, because we could take something like our Tahlia, Garden of Thraben, exile her. Our opponents all get Thalias, so non-creature spells are going to cost 3 more. You are taking your own Tahlia away from yourself, but the important part is that non-creature spells are almost going to be non-existent, because likely we already have our Grand Arbiter out there, so the tax on us isn't going to be as oppressive as it's going to be for our opponents. So pretty cool interaction there. I think that's awesome, but again, use this on one of your opponent's good creatures, then you end up getting that creature. Still pretty good. Austere Command, versatile removal for artifacts, enchantments, and creatures. Can't really beat it. Hour of Revelation, pretty cool cost reduction. Chances are the condition's going to be met, and it's going to be just 3 white mana, and you get to destroy all non-land permanents. Terminus, going to deal with indestructible creatures pretty well, puts all creatures on the bottom of their owner's libraries, and the miracle cost is sometimes relevant, but still pretty good. And we have Approach of the Second Sun, because we need a good win con in here. We need something that can help us win the game, because at certain times it's just going to be, hey, we have a lot of good control on the board right now, but we can't really do much of anything else. So Approach of the Second Sun is going to give us a way to win the game. And our instants, we play 12 of them. We have Pact of Negation, because sometimes our cost reduction is going to be too much. So having a 0 mana counterspell, we might have to pay 1 more for it, but still pretty efficient. Just don't forget to pay the mana during your upkeep or you lose the game. Path to Exile, Swords to Plowshares, 1 mana removal spells for creatures, really good. Arcane Denial, it might seem a little bit crazy to give your opponent's card draw, but it is a 2 mana counterspell, and we do give ourselves cost reduction for blue spells, so it is likely going to be 1 mana for a counterspell in Commander, which is pretty good, pretty efficient. And we also give ourselves card draw too, which is another underrated thing about the card. We do have the usual counterspell, can't really be beaten. 2 mana to counterspell is very good. Cyclonic Rift. Cyclonic Rift into an Armageddon on your turn is usually going to win you the game. You obviously want to have a better board state than Grand Arbiter, but it's just so much fun. Disallow, another good counterspell, also hits activated and triggered abilities, so pretty versatile there. Dissipate, gonna exile the spell that you want to counter. Usually it's going to be something pretty good that they can get back from their graveyard, so definitely a good answer. Render Silent, flavor-wise, it's a pretty good card. It kind of goes with what the deck's supposed to be. Azorius Control, it's also Ravnica, so pretty cool. Counterspell, they can't play spells that turn, so you stop their best spell and then you keep them from going off even further. Definitely a good card. Fairies Protection, this was the other card I was talking about earlier with Armageddon. Basically, you just Fairies Protection. All of your stuff, all your permanents phase out, so they're not on the field anymore. They don't exist until they phase back in. And then you Armageddon and destroy pretty much everyone else's lands except for yours, and all of your stuff phases back in. You have all your lands back, and you're pretty much just untouchable for that turn anyway, so pretty cool card, even if it isn't for that little combo, but still, protecting yourself is always good in Control. Cryptic Command, another good counterspell, pretty versatile, gives you the option of dealing with problem creatures or permanents. You tap down all their creatures, maybe you want to swing in uncontested, and you also get to draw a card. So you have those 4 different modes that are all pretty good. Return to Dust is going to give us exiling removal for artifacts and enchantments, which is usually the best way to go when you want to deal with them. So anyway, guys, that's going to do it for this deck tech. Hope you enjoyed it, Frogger Pirate. Had a good laugh about it. I'm not the biggest fan of Grand Arbiter, but I definitely can appreciate good solid control. Sometimes it just makes the game a little bit too boring though. Slowing down your opponents to that degree is going to make it almost impossible for them to get back into games. But as far as flavor goes, you can't really beat a good old Azorius control deck, and that is what Grand Arbiter is. Very oppressive, very well known for just being hated in the format. But still, I had fun making this deck tech. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope that if you don't know the oppression that is Grand Arbiter, if you haven't played with or played against him yet, you now know what decision to make, and I'm glad if I could be a part of that. So, you guys have a wonderful day. Void here signing off. See you all next video.